Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast that looks at the ways the U.S. is reshaping its future, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media. Hey, Katty, another week, another podcast?
Yeah, and finally another result, another deadline, another vote, right? I think a lot of people around the world thought this election would be over when the American people voted, and then we suddenly hit them this week with the fact that actually it's those electors who are voting.
Indeed. You know, you saw former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton once again call for the abolition of the Electoral College. We'll see what happens in the new year.
Yeah, but there were no big surprises. Joe Biden is going to be the next, I can't believe we're still having to say this, and this is kind of controversial and breaking news, but hey, guys, Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. And guess what? The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate, came out and congratulated the president-elect. Who knew?
Today, I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden. The president-elect is no stranger to the Senate. He's devoted himself to public service for many years. I also want to congratulate the vice president-elect, our colleague from California, Senator Harris. Beyond our differences, all Americans can take pride that our nation has a female vice president-elect for the very first time.
What an interesting, crazy year this has been. I don't know what else to call it. We probably need yet more euphemisms, but at long last, 2020 is almost exhausted, and it's time for its younger sibling, 2021, to debut.
Which cannot come soon enough. And there will be a lot of people in the Republican Party wondering what 2021 brings for them post-Donald Trump. So on that point, let's turn to this week's show. We are going to be looking at what's next for Republicans. It is a party with more than 160 years of history. It is not called the grand old party for nothing.
Indeed, indeed. And you know, the Democratic candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden, won the popular vote last month and the Electoral College vote this week, as you noted earlier. But Republicans did well in congressional elections around the country, so well, in fact, that they increased their seats in the House and may well hold on to power in the Senate.
Yeah, but there are still a lot of questions over, what the future of this party is going to be. Which way is it going to tilt now that Donald Trump really is leaving the White House? Will he or one of the members of his family make an early pitch for the 2024 Republican nomination? Has the Republican Party jettisoned its former conservative principles of being multilateral, pro-business, pro-free trade? Has it become a party of populism and isolationism beyond Donald Trump? And if it's not a Trump, who is going to go for the GOP nomination in 2024? Those are all the questions that we're going to explore in this week's show.
Before we get into that, let's listen to President-elect Biden's reaction to the Electoral College vote this week.
I'm pleased, but not surprised, by the number of my former Republican colleagues in the Senate who have acknowledged already the results of the Electoral College. I thank them, and I'm convinced we can work together for the good of the nation on many subjects. That's the duty owed to the people, to our Constitution, to our history.
Our first guest today is Brian Lanza, who was a member of President Trump's transition team back in 2016, the heady days of President Trump winning that election. Brian, you and I spoke throughout the election night and just after Election Day, so welcome back. It's good to speak to you again.
Great to hear from you again, too.
What are we? Weeks and weeks and weeks after the election day, and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has finally congratulated Joe Biden on winning the election. Was he wrong to take so long?
Yeah, probably. I think he was wrong for the overall sense of the country needing to move forward and beyond, a Trump presidency. I would say he was certainly wrong to do that. Yes.
But at the same time, President Trump, within minutes, tweeted that it was a big fraud.
Listen, the president's going to say what he says. I mean, that's the challenge that Republicans have going forward with President Trump. Now, eventually former President Trump, being piping in on everything that happens. It's you're going to have different messages going forward. I mean, President Trump's messaging wasn't always in concert with the Republican Party, and he's not going to hide his voice. My guess is he's going to be even louder. So we're going to be hearing more of him.
Brian, what do you think happens next? I mean, besides inauguration, in terms of the future of the Republican Party, is there a certain speech that's coming up? Should we wait to watch who announces for 2024 first? What do you have your eye on?
Yeah, listen, I'm going to have my eye on how President Trump takes a victory lap out of office with respect to the COVID vaccine. I think if we see that as very aggressive, you see rallies, if you look at him trying to shape his legacy through that, I think that's how the president is going to try to write his legacy, for him to run again based on, his COVID vaccine response. I think that's what I'm paying most attention to right now.
How much tension is there on Capitol Hill when you speak to members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate? In private, how frustrated are they by what's happened over the last few weeks since the election, with the president refusing to concede?
Listen, I think leadership is obviously Senate leadership and House leadership are somewhat frustrated, but I think that, they're all hoping that it ends soon. They were never really comfortable with President Trump. At least the Senate leadership was never really comfortable with his style, and they're not sort of comfortable with his style now. But listen, they have to tolerate the president at least through January 6th, through the election in Georgia, if they want to be able to hold on to the U.S. Senate. So I think, they're going to hold their noses at least through January.
Brian and Katty, I want to raise three groups of people, and I'm curious about who you guys think will step out first, kind of on their own. In my mind, there are folks who have repeatedly been in opposition to the president, like Senator Romney and former Senator Flake and Governor of Maryland Larry Hogan and others. There's a second group of folks, I guess you'd call them the young ambitious ones. I think of people like former Governor Nikki Haley, Ambassador, and Marco Rubio. And then a third is, it strikes me that maybe there's a AOC-like figure, meaning that there's someone that we don't know yet well, but who could rise out of obscurity and be someone who kind of really plants a flag. Who do you expect that we will hear from, Brian, first in the next 6 to 12 months?
First of all, let me knock out the Larry Hogans of the world, sort of that type of never Trumping Romneys. I mean, they just don't have a strong enough voice in the Republican Party, and they're not going to, post-Trump. You talk about the Rubios, the Nikki Haleys of the world. They're almost stale and stagnant at this point. I mean, they ran, they lost, they moved on. So it's almost going to have to be a fresh face, i.e. Ron DeSantis or even Doug Ducey out of Arizona.
Hold on a second. Wait about, you didn't add there one of the Trump family.
Well, I mean, listen, I'm a huge fan of Don Jr. I consider him a friend. I think he will struggle in the short term to make his case of why he should be president. I think the Trump family, the kids, they need to get some government experience underneath their belt before they can make a valid case to why they need to enter the national office. Just being the son of a successful billionaire and of a former president, doesn't necessarily get you to that stage. I mean, George W. Bush and Jeb Bush, they had to go to Florida and Texas.
It got Donald Trump into the White House.
Well, he was the outlier. It didn't get Jeb. I mean, Jeb and George Bush, they both had to become governors before they ran for president.
Brian, are we at a sort of pivot moment where the identity of the Republican Party is shifting? I mean, if you're right that the future of the Republican Party is Trumpism, even if it's not Donald Trump, but it's what he embodies, that basically the Republican Party is going to become the party of working class, less educated, rural Americans, and the Democratic Party is going to become the party of urban elites, more educated Americans.
Yeah, I mean,
which would be kind of ironic, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is ironic, but it's also, you keep in mind, what Trump did that was different than every other Republican who'd run for office in modern time is he actually talked about the negative effects of a trade deal, which, completely gutted a lot of these communities in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Republicans never talked to that crowd. They never talked about the plight that these communities had gone through. Trump's economic positions, they're not Republican as everybody thinks they are. His trade positions fair trade, not free trade. That's not a Republican talking point. That's a Democratic talking point. So I think the party evolves. And so when you talk about the gains that we're going to make among working class voters, it reminds me of what Karl Rove once said. It was rather recently, I think it was last year. He said, for the Republican Party at this current trend to become the majority party for a very long time, all it needs is 5% more Democratic males to vote for them. And they have a winning coalition, irrespective of any demographic change, for the next 40 years.
Brian, as we close out, question to you. 4 years later, do you still admire the 45th president, particularly given the last several weeks?
Yeah, listen, I would never use that I admire him, but I love his fight. I love that he just fights for the things he believes in. And as uncomfortable as I am where he is now in a month after the election and he's continuing this fight, I sort of appreciate the fact that he just doesn't give up. There's some things that I don't like about it. Obviously, to me, the line became too much. But I think overall, the policies very much line up. Listen, I'm a working class Republican. My parents were immigrants. They came here and worked hard and built their own businesses. That's what President Trump was selling. And I think that's where the country is.
Brian Lanza, so interesting. Brian, as ever, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Our next guest is somebody who knows the Republican Party very well, or at least knows perhaps the old Republican Party. Between January 2009 and January of 2011, Michael Steele was the chairperson of the Republican National Committee, the first and only African-American to hold that post. But in this last election, Michael, you endorsed Joe Biden.
Yeah, it's a slightly different opportunity for me. It really broke along a number of lines, some of which you and Brian were just talking about. At the end of the day, Katty, it really has to do with how you value the country and how you evaluate the underlying principles that have defined it and the rule of law and the constitutional ideals. And from my perspective, Donald Trump abrogated all of that. He decidedly and in a very direct and sometimes ham-handed way worked against those very norms and constitutional ideals. And that was more than a straw to break the political back for me.
How hard has it been to stand out? You're on television all the time. You have a big Twitter following. You have radio shows. How hard has it been to be a Republican opposing Donald Trump in the way that you have? Have you had threats from people? Do you get a lot of grief for it? Do you get a lot of abuse for it?
It's actually, I've been blessed that way. I think people know me well enough to know that I don't suffer their foolishness easily or lightly. So if you come at me, be prepared to of what you get. I think people know that, number one. Number two, I also think that people know I'm serious, Katty. They know how I feel about this. I mean, despite everything, I've stayed in this fight. I've not walked away. It's been frustrating to watch some of our mutual friends leave the party over the last few years. My argument is the more a band of fools, if you want to call us that, or a band of patriots, either way, the more of us standing together, the stronger the effort, the stronger the fight. But I get it. I understand for some, it's more than a bridge too far. So I've been lucky in that sense that I've not had the level of crazy and ugly people coming at me because I think they know where I'm coming from. I got involved in politics because I thought that's the mechanism by which we can affect public policy. We can have a positive change. So I'm not influenced by a lot of those things that a lot of people are. I don't really give a damn what you think of me because the only person I'm concerned about is what my parents and my wife and my kids think of me. The rest of you, okay. Thank you for sharing.
Michael, how did you hear that conversation with Brian Lanza? What were your thoughts there? I heard him more bullish on President Trump and his continued role going forward than maybe I expected.
I kind of agree with some of what Brian was saying and disagree a lot in other areas. I think he's absolutely right with respect to the fact that Donald Trump is not going away. He will be a former president of the United States with a Twitter account. He will be a complete pain in Joe Biden's behind for the next 4 years. He will, in my estimation, try to set up a shadow government of sorts, with the narrative being sort of a setup for a run again in 2024, which I don't think he will do. But I think what it does is freezes the field, the political field. This is the party of Trump. The Republican Party no longer exists as we know it. The idea that, candidates are going to be running on Trumpism for the next 30 years means that we won't win another national election.
Why? Why? Trump did?
Well, because the country decidedly is not buying that. Despite what anyone wants to say about the demographics work against the party. Yes, you may have elected some minorities in 2020. The realities around that have to do more with the very effective campaign around the crazy narrative the Democrats put out about policing. But that's a one-off. I think at the end of the day, the party's going to have to reconcile the positions it's taken on putting kids in cages, embracing white nationalism and racism, despite the fact that you may elect a black or Hispanic or female candidate. I wouldn't want to be a black Republican elected official having to go to the black community and justify the Proud Boys. So the reality of it is you look at the short game, but you have to look at the long game. And the long game does not play well for the Republicans.
Who are some of the key players who you're keeping your eye on over the next, not just 4 years, but really over the next year? And is there someone who you expect to signal whatever the next step for Republicans will be?
No. No.
That's simple. Okay. So no Romney.
Look, no.
They're all Trump.
Mitt Romney, but Mitt Romney, I don't know if Mitt Romney has ambitions to run in 2024. I think to the extent that Brian spoke about Romney having skin in the game, and I admire Mitt Romney quite a lot, but I don't know, Mitt Romney standing in the town square, as we like to say, the herald of good things to come for a reformed Republican Party, won't have anyone stopping and taking orders on that. This is the party of Trump, is that going back to my first point, and Trump will make sure it remains the party of Trump because he's not going away. There's a reason why he's putting out the word and trying to place his son and his girlfriend, Kimberly Guilfoyle, as political operatives and players. It's the reason why he wants the current chairwoman to remain the chairwoman. So then you tell me who emerges, who's going to stand up if they haven't already and remained in office, and say, you know what, Mr. President, thank you for your service to the country, but it's time to move on. Who's going to say that? Who's going to do that?
Michael, is this a kind of, let's zoom out to 50,000 feet. I mean, is this almost a philosophical shift in the way that conservatives think, in the sense that all of those things that when you were running the Republican National Committee, that
Right.
conservatives in America held dear, free trade, openness to immigration, cutting deficits in the country. Those were the sort of tenets of American conservatism. And now all of that seems to have been chucked out the window in support of really a personality. I mean, this is about Donald Trump, the man and the person and the way he is, as much as it is about his philosophies, right? I mean, did Republican leaders like yourself get it wrong? I mean, did conservatives
No, we didn't get
change?
it wrong. It's a philosophical
But millions
abandonment.
of Republicans voted for Trump. So I'm just wondering, maybe they didn't actually believe in cutting deficits or all of those things that you believed in.
Yeah, that's something to be sorted out. I think that's going to be part of the bright line, battle lines that are going to be drawn. Do you believe that the rule of law, meaning that you follow constitutional norms and principles, do you believe, that it still has value? Do you affirm, again, that, fair trade, as Brian rightly pointed out, is a nice democratic concept, but the reality for Republicans and fiscal conservatives has been this idea about free markets and how we trust, market forces to take into account all forms of human behavior, et cetera. So those are going to be big battles. If people are up for the battle, Katty, they may not be. They may figure, that's a crock. I don't have time to make that case anymore. It's much easier to hype Trumpism, that's the new standard. Okay, then let's have that debate. I'm not willing to cede this ground along national security lines, economic lines, fiscal lines, certainly on cultural lines, to this form of Trumpism that has emerged. The party, I've always been critical of the party and its approach to, for example, some of the social issues of the day. Now we seem to have gone the other way where we don't really give a damn, because we get behind a guy who's been, an adulterer and doesn't really espouse family values, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have this hypocrisy across these lines that have to be reconciled. And I don't know if the rank and file are really ready to do that, or if they're just willing to say, you know what, we don't want the fight. We accept this new idea, and we're going to go with it. We'll see.
But does Trumpism survive without the Trump show?
Sure, because Trump does not go away. Look how long Reaganism lasted after Reagan. One of the big differences, though, after Reagan was there was this struggle over who would become the next Reagan. Right. And that was an internal structure. Reagan held together two very different and competing interests within the party. Traditional republicanism, which was a Northeastern-based New England-style republicanism, a sort of a patrician form of republicanism, versus this new emerging sort of populist form of republicanism that was really animated by the moral majority in the 1980s, for example, and sort of this law and order, war on drugs kind of mindset. And he held those competing interests together. He was the avatar for them. So what has Trump become the avatar of in this modern age of the party is something very different. And the difference, though, is that he has a stronger grip on that than Reagan may have had. And that's where I think the fight is going to see itself play out.
Michael, as we close, I'm curious, when I hear you speak, I not only hear you laying out how you see this evolving, looking both backwards and forwards, but forgive me, I think I hear you a little heartbroken. Am I overreading that?
No, you're not. It's disappointing as hell to see what's happened to the party. I became a Republican at 17 years old. I grew up in Washington, D.C. at a time when being a Black Roman Catholic conservative Republican was not the best thing to do with your day, right? But I was committed because I believed in a set of values and ideas that could be operationalized through the body politic as a Republican. My mother, ironically, as a Democrat, taught me a lot of these values. I saw a lot of that reflected in my political hero, Ronald Reagan, despite the warts and the stuff that we, know now that we didn't know then and maybe did know then, but the times were different. Despite all of that, they still held resonance. What are we saying about the country today when the president of the United States refuses to acknowledge that he lost an election by almost 8 million votes, when you have a president who would rather carry the water for dictators and, very bad people around the globe than to affirm and restore and assure the relationship with our alliances in Europe and elsewhere. So these things, for me, they matter because they should. And when they stop mattering, when they no longer carry the weight and concern of the people, or as importantly, the president, then, yeah, it's disappointing and it's frustrating.
So here we are, Michael, December 2020, and the Republican Party is the Trump Party. Do you still think of yourself? Do you still call yourself a member of the Republican Party? I
do, most importantly, because I still believe in those values. I still believe in those ideals. They still matter to me. And when they no longer matter inside of this particular political skeleton, I will move on to something else and will engage in that something else at that time. But right now, I'm a self-styled Lincoln Republican because I believe in those Lincoln-esque values and ideas about individual rights and liberties and why those things matter, about the importance of the Union. You have, the current chairman of the Republican Party in the state of Texas talking about succession. I mean, dude, seriously, get a grip. That's not where the country needs to go. That's not what the country should be about. And we need adherence of the old way, if you will, of sort of the mainline ideas of republicanism to make the case. And if we fail in making the case, Katty, then, doesn't mean we die and wither on the vine. We go to something else. We do it another way. And I'll continue to pursue that until it is very clear to me that republicanism as an idea can no longer be expressed.
Michael Steele, always appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a good holiday.
You too, Carlos, and Katty, it's always a joy whenever I get to hang with you. You know that. So thank you for the opportunity to be on the program with you guys.
Michael, thank you. And have a break over the holiday.
Oh, you know I am.
Michael, thank you. Look, I thought, what was interesting I felt about that discussion on the future of the Republican Party is that we had a Hispanic Republican who supports Donald Trump and clearly believes in Trump's ability to fight for working class Americans. And we have an African American Republican who has been with the party, as he said, for over 4 decades, who is appalled by Trump and by Trumpism and the nationalism and exclusionary politics that Trumpism seems to represent. But they were both equally kind of committed and thoughtful, I thought, about their positions.
Very much so. And both fundamentally believe that Donald Trump, who did win the presidency and won yet another 74 million votes in a second run, neither was really willing to engage in a vision of the next 4 years that didn't have Donald Trump at the center.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just because we are so close to it. But I thought that was interesting. There was no counter narrative or parallel, option that they really countenanced.
No, even though Brian is convinced that Trump will run again and Michael seems to be convinced that Trump won't run again, they still nonetheless agreed that Trump is going to be the future and the force behind the Republican Party's ideals, and Republican Party candidates.
One of the most interesting things I heard, and I can't remember whether it was from Brian or from Michael, was this notion that President Trump will take a victory lap in and around the vaccine success, if indeed there is success. And I thought that was intriguing and what that could end up meaning if he does do that, quote unquote, successfully.
Yeah, and also, I do think there is this issue of the Trump show, right? And Trumpism is very much about the Trump show and Trump's personality. And what Brian said at the end about how he admires him because he's a fighter and he comes out like a fighter at those rallies and stuff. And I just don't see Ron DeSantis from Florida, the governor of Florida, or Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, being able to recreate that. And there is a liability there, I guess, for any party, Democrat or Republican, Conservative or Labour in the UK. If you build your party around a personality, and then once that personality is gone, which it inevitably is, kind of what's left? How do you sustain that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that they were not fully accounting for is that part of what may be true about Trump's success is that he's opened up who can be a presidential candidate to a broader group than just elected office holders. And that I do expect to see more former athletes, more celebrity business people, more actors and others run for office. And so maybe there will be a show. It just may not be called the Trump Show, right? There may be a little bit like the Real Housewives franchise instead of the Real Housewives of Atlanta. Do you appreciate that analogy?
I like
Instead of the Real Housewives of Atlanta, it may be New Jersey or Beverly Hills. And so instead of the Trump Show, is it the Mark Cuban show? Is it the whomever show? So I think that there is more fluidity here than either of them felt comfortable acknowledging, and I'm intrigued to see where it will go.
Or is it the Don Jr. show? I still think that's possible.
Oh, I think there'd be a much larger Shakespearean battle with his sister. And that would be intriguing to watch.
Well, that would be fun television.
Wouldn't that be? Wouldn't that be?
Yeah, we would watch that one.
Indeed.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.